Okay, so, well, first of all, so we're just going to do a quick recap of the carbon lectures and make sure that, well, at least you all know. So, the key things are when carbon dioxide dissolves in water, it splits apart into these different species by these proportions, and those proportions are dependent on the pH of the ocean. This doesn't work, that's great. And importantly, only the carbon dioxide species can interact with the atmosphere, whereas the carbonate and the bicarbonate cannot. So the proportions of these carbon species in the oceans determine how much carbon can actually be in the atmosphere and how much can be in the ocean. And that's what this plot says. So the higher the pH, the more carbon is in these two species, the carbonate and the bicarbonate, that can't interact with the atmosphere. Okay, so that means that the ocean can store much more carbon. There's also a partitioning of carbon between the surface ocean and the deep ocean. Okay, and that's largely driven by mixing between the two, but also by this export of carbon from the surface ocean by marine kind of biology kind of going on, and exporting it down into the deep ocean. So that increases the total carbon content, the total dissolved in organic carbon, and the pH. This doesn't do anything. Yeah, so that pH change in the ocean by the addition of CO2 is buffered by the dissolution of calcium carbonate. Okay, so any change in adding CO2 to the ocean to acidify it is buffered by the dissolution or the lack of precipitation of calcium carbonate. Okay, so we're going to start on the next couple of lectures will be on nutrients. So these are the elements that are critical for life, okay, but are not kind of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. Okay, so these are kind of somewhat, I think, some of the minor elements that are important for life. We're going to concentrate on nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Right, so I'll just take a register. Okay, so I can figure out these here. Do feel free to sign in, that would help as well, so I don't have to trawl through and find out who you all are. Right, so nitrogen is what we're going to talk about today. It's used for all kinds of things, kind of industrially and agriculturally, but it's really one of the key critical elements for life existing on Earth. So today's lecture will have a bit of an introduction, go through the land and ocean cycle, and look at how we've maybe altered the balance of this critical nutrient through anthropogenic activities. Okay, so nitrogen is critical for life. So without nitrogen, okay, so we can't have things like amino acids. It means we can't have DNA. So as an example, this little give us off a pointer. This bond here, and this basically is joining two amino acids together into a peptide chain to make a protein. So if we didn't have nitrogen, we wouldn't have to be able to have proteins, and that's kind of quite important if you're an animal. It is also used in kind of plants as well as part of the DNA of plants. So without nitrogen, okay, life can't happen. Okay, so if you look at a map of the nitrogen distribution in the ocean down here, okay, you can see that that's kind of somewhat matches the distribution of where life happens. So if we're missing any one of these kind of nutrient elements, then we can't have life happening, and this is kind of important. And so if we can supply nutrients to some of these kind of life poor regions of the Earth, then that might promote stuff happening. Okay. So looking at some of the stocks of where nitrogen is on the planet. Unlike, I guess, the carbon cycle, most of the nitrogen is in the atmosphere, and that's as N2 gas. There's some in the ocean, not as much as there is carbon. There's loads in rocks, and there's some in soil and the biological sphere as well. If we start looking at some of the forms of nitrogen now, we've got nitrogen gas at the top, which is two nitrogens that are triple bonded together. Okay, so those are really, really strongly bonded together. which means that it's very, very hard for them to break apart, okay? Which effectively means that nitrogen gas N2 is completely biologically inert. Okay, so life cannot use the top form of nitrogen. Okay, some of the other species, nitrous oxide and ammonia, those are gaseous species, so those can be found in the atmosphere and dissolved in water. Okay, because Henry's law applies to all gases, not just CO2. So if there's any of these gaseous species in the atmosphere, there will be some in the water that's in contact with the atmosphere. And then we have some species, ammonium, nitrates, and nitrites. So these are basically ionic forms which only exist in the dissolved phase. So this is kind of what it says at the bottom. So autotrophs, so these are basically things that photosynthesize, can only use the nitrate and the ammonium form. Okay, so all of these other forms up here, not so useful for life. Okay, they are important though. So this is the nitrogen cycle. Okay, we're going to go through and explain different parts of this, how nitrogen transforms from one species to the other, making it available and then unavailable to life, okay, and how it then moves between these reservoirs on Earth. Okay, so the first process is nitrogen fixation. So this is one of the most important processes because this takes the unusable, useless form of nitrogen that's in the atmosphere, the N2, and transforms it to something that's useful. Okay, so this effectively takes N2 gas and converts it into either nitrate or ammonia. Now, because nitrogen, molecular nitrogen N2 is triple bonded, okay, that makes it extremely hard to do this process. Okay, so you need enormous amounts of energy put into a system to convert N2 to nitrate or ammonia, or ammonium in this case. So lightning, okay, you have extremely high temperature and extremely high pressure inside a lightning bolt. Okay, you also have lots of nitrogen gas because the atmosphere is kind of made of nitrogen. You also have lots of oxygen because the atmosphere is made of oxygen. So the extreme high temperature and pressure combine to make nitrogen into N2, into N2O or some nitrous oxide, which eventually forms nitrate. Other processes, the Bosch-Haber process, which is an industrial process which takes hydrogen gas and nitrogen gas, and again puts them at high temperature and high pressure in place of a catalyst, usually iron, and that requires an enormous amount of energy, and that creates ammonia. And then you've got this third process, which is biological fixation. So this is a group of organisms, so-called diazotrophs, which can take nitrogen gas, dissolved, and convert that into ammonia, okay, which can then be useful. But all of these processes require an enormous amount of energy, so either kind of temperature and pressure or an enormous amount of biological energy to do this process. Okay, so let's go looking at this nitrogen fixation in a little bit more detail, some of the pathways. Okay, so I mentioned lightning at the top, so that takes nitrogen gas, oxygen gas, high temperature, high pressure, and forms NO, N2O, and nitrate. Industrial fixation is nitrogen gas and hydrogen, again, high temperature and pressure. And then biotic fixation is basically taking dissolved, I think I've got it on the next slide actually, biological fixation. So biological fixation makes use of this enzyme nitrogenase, which uses this, basically inside this spirally thing, there is one of these, okay, it's got lots of iron and sulfur in it, it's very kind of reactive. And this molecule can attach onto it a nitrogen, okay, and use and basically rip it apart and produce a ammonia molecule. Okay, so to do this, it has to use an enormous amount of energy. So kind of like cells and biological organisms use this molecule called the adenosine triphosphate to basically as a battery to store energy and then to use it. And you can see that this process to can take apart one nitrogen molecule uses 16 of these things. Okay, so it's enormously energy intensive. But if an organism doesn't have any nitrogen, it can't grow anyway, so it has to make its own. So this process only typically happens in places where there is a lack of nitrogen, okay, making it energetically favourable or ecologically competitively favourable to use all your energy making nitrogen rather than for growing, because you need it. Okay, so this is this organism Trichodesmium, which is one of these diatotrophs, and this is one of the most probably one of the most important organisms in the ocean, because it's responsible for approximately 50% of the nitrogen, the biologically available nitrogen production in the ocean, which is nice. Okay, so this is nitrogen fixation. So we've got these biological fixation. Okay, in this case, this is in these diatotroph bacteria that live in kind of root nodules on land in leguminous plants. Lightning is a small component, only kind of like 3 teragrams per year, and industrial fixation, and we also have fixation in the ocean. So these are the fluxes. Now, obviously, in different parts of Earth history. Okay, so before life evolved, obviously, lightning was the most important source of biologically available nitrogen, because there was no other fixation around. Okay, so back to the nitrogen cycle. So this is this process here. We take nitrogen gas and we produce ammonia, or we produce some kind of nitrate, or one of these things over here. Okay, depending on if this is the lightning route, these are the industrial fixation and the biological fixation. Okay, so the next part of the nitrogen cycle is those nutrients, either the nitrate or the ammonium, are used by plants to grow. Okay, so that takes up that nitrogen into an organic form. So this is basically this form we're taking the nitrogen, we're putting it into, so this R is just some generic kind of long hydrocarbon chain. Okay, generic, like representative life in general. Okay, so this forms organic forms of nitrogen, and then when those organisms die and decay, that nitrogen gets released back into the environment. So that's kind of this process. So basically nitrogen is cycling between life and like organic material that's decaying, and this can be kind of direct decay of plant material or going through an animal and then being excreted, and then nitrates and ammonium being kind of like put into the earth that way. Yeah, so this is this process of assimilation. So we're taking these forms, nitrate and ammonium, and we're producing organic matter by life happening, and then these things then break apart and form ammonium again when the organism dies. So if this ammonium builds up in the environment, if you have lots and lots and lots of decay in a particular environment, you build up lots and lots of ammonia. That for quite a lot of organisms, that becomes toxic. Okay, so there has to be a process that gets rid of the ammonium. So this is, if you build up too much of this stuff, okay, that inhibits the amount of life that can go on. So we have to have some process that takes it away, and this is this nitrification. So this taking of ammonium and oxidizing it to nitrite and then to nitrate. Okay, so this is processes which are basically mediated by bacteria. Okay, the bacteria of the Nitrosomas factory and the Nitrobacter factory, and they basically take these forms of nitrogen, so they can take ammonium and they can, in an environment where there is oxygen. Okay, so this only happens in an environment where there's oxygen, and that produces nitrite, and this one takes the nitrite and turns it into nitrate. Okay, so these are basically, we're oxidizing on this pathway. So this process can only happen if the environment has a lot of oxygen in it. If we have an anoxic environment, so in a bog or maybe in some parts of the ocean which have oxygen minimum zones, this process can't happen. Okay, so in these places, the concentrations of ammonia might build up, okay, and inhibit the amount of life that can go on in those places. Yeah, so this is these are these processes. So these processes, this basically nitrification of ammonia to nitrite, and nitrite to nitrate, you can see that these both require oxygens for this to happen. Okay? They also tend to produce hydrogen ions. So that means that if the environment is lacking in oxygen or it's acidic, okay, then these processes are inhibited. So one potential consequence of the acidification of the ocean is that we might actually slow down this process of nitrification, okay, which will limit the availability of nitrate for life again. Okay, so we'll see later that actually quite a lot of the supply of available nutrients to the ocean is not actually through this fixation process. It's actually just going around this loop at the bottom, okay, constantly supplying nitrate, which can be used by organisms and then returning this way. But if you slow down this process here by either reducing the amount of oxygen in the ocean or in the environment more generally, or lowering the pH, making it more acidic, then that might inhibit the amount of life that can happen. The other point that should be made on this slide, I guess, is that this species here, nitrate, is extremely soluble in water. It's very, very soluble. So that means that it can very easily be washed away from the land, which is particularly important. So I'm glad I remember to say that. So this is you guys see that? It's a picture of a field. See if we can make it a little bit darker. No one's looking more. I'm sure that'll help you. So this is a field. You can see that lots of stuff is being washed off that field. Any nitrogen that's been added to that field, either by biological fixation by plants in that field, or by us putting artificial nitrates on that field, are just being washed off. And so this is a big problem because so this if we basically wash this from the land into the ocean, we've then lost that nutrient from being available on land. Okay, so so once again, I guess nitrate is a useful nutrient, so we do add it to the land ourselves. But too much of it, okay, is a bad thing. Okay, and it's not bad in itself. So too much nitrate is not toxic. I guess it is toxic at ridiculously high concentrations because it would make nitric acid. But at these concentrations or any kind of environmental concentration, it's not really an issue. But the problem is that if you have lots and lots of nutrients, lots of nitrate, maybe other nutrients, in a particular environment, that would promote lots and lots of life to happen. Okay, so this is kind of the kind of thing you might get in the ocean, where you get lots and lots of algae growing, lots of kind of biological activity in kind of like bogs like this. And that production of biological material will produce carbon. That carbon will sink to the bottom, or will be respired in the water column in these places, and will use up all of the oxygen. So this map here is basically a cut through the ocean at 300 meters. So it's not a map of the surface of the ocean, it's a map of the ocean at 300 meters. So this is the organic material that's formed in the surface where there's been lots of nutrients, and then sunk down and being respired by bacteria, and that respiration has removed the oxygen from the water. So these pink areas are places in the ocean which the oxygen has been removed from, okay, which is quite bad if you're a fish and you swim through that water, because you'll die. But it's also a big problem in coastal regions as well, where we have a very localized source of nutrients causing a process called nitrification, which basically means many nutrients, and this basically removes the oxygen from the water. Okay, so another way that we can lose nitrate in particular is this process called denitrification. So rather than just washing it off the land, okay, it can also be transformed back into this unusable nitrogen gas. Okay. And this happens in environments where there is no oxygen. So in these environments where we might have put too many nutrients into the system, and life has then happened, produced lots of carbon, that carbon respires, removes the oxygen, okay, that means that there's still a lot of organic matter hanging around, but there's nothing to oxidize it. Well, there's certainly no oxygen to oxidize it, but what we can use, or what bacteria can use, instead of using oxygen to oxidize the remaining organic matter, it can actually use other electron acceptors. And the next best one after oxygen turns out to be nitrate. Okay? So nitrate is reduced to nitrogen gas, and bacteria use that instead of oxygen to oxidize organic matter. So this is this series of reactions here. So the process of, for instance, organic matter, okay, being oxidized to CO2. Okay, so you can do this reaction by using oxygen as your basically electron donor. Okay, or sorry, electron acceptor. And that's the most energy efficient. So if you take 1 mole of organic carbon, some oxygen, you get some energy out. Okay, so that's the most energy efficient way. So bacteria that do that will dominate the population of bacteria until oxygen runs out. Okay, then bacteria that like to use nitrogen will kind of take over, and they're quite efficient as well. Okay, so if we have a water column with some sediment down here, and this maybe in contact with the atmosphere at the top, all this water here will have lots of oxygen in it, and then the organic matter in the sediment will use up that oxygen, okay, as it's respired, and then you'll run out of oxygen, and then you'll start to use nitrate, and then you'll run out of nitrate, and then you'll start to use some of these other things. Okay, so we'll come on to this in another lecture and maybe in other courses. But this is basically important because this is another way that we can lose available nitrate from the system. Okay, so this kind of is looking how we're trying to balance the budget now. So we have this loss term out of the system from denitrification. Okay, so we've got biological fixation on land, we've got denitrification in places like where we've removed oxygen, so in soils perhaps, or in bogs, or in anoxic lakes, removing that nitrogen back to the atmosphere. Yes, so this only happens where you've got no oxygen. Okay, so things like wetlands. You do get some if you burn biomass, so that's effectively used as an oxidizer when you burn fuel. It has organic nitrogen in it. So we do get some emissions from fossil fuel burnings this way. One consequence of this is that the oxidation of nitrate to nitrogen gas, so the reduction of oxygen and nitrate to nitrogen gas, goes in 2 steps. It goes from nitrate to N2O and then to N2. Okay, so the N2, that's just what the atmosphere is made of, but this intermediate N2O, so just to highlight again this intermediate step, so we go from nitrate to, in this case, NO2 to N2, and there's also some N2O formed in this denitrification process. And this is a problem because it's a very, very powerful greenhouse gas. So if we had 1 kilogram of N2O, that's worth kind of almost 300 kilograms of carbon dioxide. So if you look at our emissions of this gas through time, or this is the atmospheric concentrations of this through time, as we've changed our basically farming habits, we've increased the amount of nitrous oxide production, and you can see the radiative effect of that. So even though it's only 300 and something parts per billion, so 1,000 times less than the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, you can see the radiative effect of that. That's this kind of like medium blue line here. Okay, so it's smaller than the carbon dioxide and the methane in the atmosphere in terms of its radiative significance, but it is nonetheless a non-negligible component of greenhouse gas warming. So if we promote more denitrification, okay, so if we make more of the regions of the ocean anoxic, if we kind of like have more rice fields, if we have more wetlands as the climate gets wetter, one of the potential impacts of that might be that we start to produce more nitrous oxide, and that affects the climate, which would be bad. So that's this term, this denitrification kind of branch of the nitrogen cycle, which is basically a loss term. So it's a way of losing available for biology nitrogen. So to look at this cycle in a slightly different way, okay, so rather than just kind of look at this kind of somewhat abstract kind of like spidery mess of a cycle up here, we can actually maybe try to look at where in the environments these processes happen. Okay, so if we just think of the microbial processes that are going on. So nitrogen gas, okay, has to be fixed by some form. Okay, so that could be lightning, industrial fixation, or biological fixation. So the biological fixation of nitrogen into kind of ammonium or ammonia forms, that has to happen in an aerobic condition. So if it's in the soil, it needs to be a well-oxygenated soil. So in the ocean, it needs to be in a well-oxygenated part of the ocean. And it uses up enormous amounts of energy. Okay, so organisms have to invest a lot of their kind of like biological potential energy that they've like stored up as kind of ATP to do this process. Okay, so this stuff can basically go around in a loop of degradation, okay, into ammonium forms, and then that can be used again backwards and forwards. Okay, or it can be basically buried into an anoxic environment where the same degradation can happen. Okay, if we get into an oxic environment, we can do this nitrification process. Okay, so only this process taking this ammonia or ammonium and turning that to nitrate. Only in the oxic kind of conditions that can happen. And then that nitrate can be used again by basically primary producers to make organic matter again, so this loop can come back again. Okay? Or we can, if that nitrate makes its way into an environment that's poor in oxygen, okay, so if that nitrate can basically go into the bottom of an anoxic lake or into a wetland or into a bit of the ocean that's got no oxygen, then bacteria can then convert that available nitrate into nitrogen gas or nitrous oxide or this nitrite again. So where it can be lost back up into the atmosphere. Okay, so that's basically a description of where these kind of processes happen from the point of view of the chemistry of the environments, whether it's an anoxic or an oxic environment. Because it's important to understand that these environments are also kind of climate sensitive, so how much oxygen there can be in an environment is determined on the amount of biology and also the physical stratification of a body of water. These things are determined by temperature and availability of light, availability of other nutrients. So all of these systems end up being interlinked, and we'll come on to that in future lectures. Okay, so I guess the last term for the land cycle is this runoff. So when we make nitrate, okay, and that's sitting in some soil somewhere, it rains a lot, that will ultimately get washed into rivers, lakes, and ultimately into the ocean. So there's this flux of nitrogen between the land and the ocean that's mostly through runoff. Okay. So the next bit is going to be relevant for almost all of the nutrient cycles, and that's that it doesn't each kind of mole or atom of nitrogen, when it gets fixed into an available form, it doesn't just get used once. So if we look at how much primary productivity there is on land, so how many gigatons of carbon get fixed out of the atmosphere, we usually basically measure some plants for their carbon to nitrogen ratio, usually get an average of 50. So for every one molecule of nitrogen, every one mole of nitrogen, you can get 50 moles of carbon kind of sequestered out of the atmosphere. So if we work out how much nitrogen we would need to sustain this amount of primary productivity, okay, so you kind of take the how many tons of carbon, divide it by 12 to get the number of moles, and then do the same thing with the nitrogen. You get this kind of number here, which is quite big, and it turns out that you would need about this 1,000 teragrams of of nitrogen. That's 1,000, well, you need this much, 1,400 teragrams of nitrogen. And if you actually look at how much is actually fixed, it's only 143 teragrams. So there's some missing, and this missing is this basically this recycling. So once nitrogen is fixed into the available form, it can be used a large number of times through the system by being up and taken by organisms. That organism decays and then releases its nitrogen back into the environment, and it can be used again and it decays. So it basically goes round and round and round it, and this is called internal cycling. So within one reservoir, okay, one of the nutrients can be used many, many times. Okay, so this is basically going back and forth between the soils. So this is kind of why maintaining the quality of soil so they can retain their nutrients is so important, because the more efficient you can make these kind of loops go round, okay, and this loop go round without losing stuff, okay, then the kind of the better, the more life can happen, which is nice if you like life. If you like life. If you like lice, I know that'd be weird. Okay, so to summarise the land cycle, there are these three key processes. There's nitrogen fixation, and that's got three kind of flavours. It's got the biological fixation, lightning, and industrial fixation. And then we've got nitrification, which takes the ammonium that's been fixed or has been produced by decay of organic matter, and that produces nitrate, which can become biologically available again. And then we have denitrification, which is this lost term, which produces this greenhouse gas nitrous oxide, and ultimately puts nitrogen gas back into the atmosphere. And for all of those processes, microbial activity is really, really important. Without these processes are all biologically mediated, except maybe lightning. Pretty sure lightning is not microbially mediated. And then lastly, this importance of internal cycling. So the reuse of nutrients through growth, decay, growth, decay, growth, decay is really important. Okay, so this is just quickly looking at these lost terms. So we can lose nitrogen from the system by it being in a gaseous phase, and then it kind of escapes up into the atmosphere. Or we can make it into a soluble phase, and it can kind of run off into the ocean. There's also this additional process, which I guess only recently discovered, last 20 years or so, which is this process called anammox, which is the anaerobic oxidation of ammonia, or anaerobic ammonium oxidation. So this is basically a process of removing ammonia from a system. Okay, which previously you should remember that to get rid of ammonia, you have to do nitrification, which requires oxygen. Okay, to oxidize the ammonium to nitrite and then nitrate. But there's this additional process, anammox, which so this is the traditional nitrification. But it turns out that actually, if you've got ammonium and nitrite in an environment, these two can react together to basically get rid of your ammonium and your nitrate and return nitrogen back into the unusable end form. Okay, so this turns out to be actually quite a big process in the ocean. Okay, particularly in these regions of the oceans that are very oxygen poor. And actually, it's now used. We've made use of this series of reactions in wastewater treatment. So one of the problems with our wastewater, with the sewage plant, is that it has a lot of ammonium in it. And we used to get rid of that by bubbling lots of oxygen through the water or air. That caused smell because you were bubbling lots of air through your sewage, which was lovely. But we can now do this in an anoxic environment with a lid on it by promoting this reaction, by adding nitrite. Okay, so this is this process here. We can basically add, if these two species are in an environment, we can add them together, and that's another way of losing nitrogen from the system. Okay, so we're going to have a look at the ocean now, because I promised at the beginning we would look at the ocean, and you know I like to keep promises sometimes. So just like with the carbon cycle, there's a surface layer of the ocean and a deep layer of the ocean. And in the surface layer of the ocean, that's in contact with the atmosphere. Okay, so there can be a gas exchange, okay, which is determined by Henry's law. Okay, but it turns out that the solubility of nitrogen is a lot lower than the solubility of CO2, so it has a different solubility constant. So actually less nitrogen could get into the ocean. So this is the solubility of nitrogen, this is the solubility of CO2 at some reference temperature, can't remember what. But this puts this nitrogen into the water. Okay. Now, that's completely useless because it's this triple bonded nitrogen-nitrogen molecule. Okay, so we have to have some process that fixes that nitrogen. And we can't have lightning because it's the ocean and we don't have lightning in the ocean. We can't have the industrial Bosch Harbor process because it's the ocean and all of our equipment would get wet. So the only game in town really is the microbial fixation of nitrate. Okay, so this only happens in regions of the ocean which are nitrogen poor because it's really energy intensive. So around the coasts, we might have nitrogen inputted from runoff. Okay, so this will be rivers putting nitrogen into the environment. But out in the open ocean, where we're basically lacking a source of available nitrogen, this guy can go nuts. Okay, so this is the guy going nuts. I guess bacteria not really gender specific, but so this is a bloom of this. This is the organism Trichodesmium, which is taking nitrogen gas dissolved in the water and producing ammonium. So this is a bloom of it as the ship goes past. You can kind of see it in space. So these things do form kind of large blooms when the conditions are kind of just right. When there is no nitrate available, they can do their thing. So these are those kind of fluxes. So we've got this flux in of mostly nitrate running off the land, okay, being inputted in coastal regions. But we also have biological fixation, okay, taking this nitrogen gas, it's being dissolved in the ocean by Henry's law, and then it's being fixed biology. So that's the main source of nitrogen in the ocean. Okay. There's this additional term, precipitation. So if you get stuff blown off the land, okay, that will eventually blow into the sea, usually as rain. As rain, basically, water condenses around dust particles. Those dust particles might have some nitrate in them because they've come from the land. Soil rich. Some of that. So that is also a minor source of nitrate to the ocean. But again, we'll do our little sum to figure out how much of this stuff we need. So the marine primary productivity is almost the same as the land primary productivity, about 60 gigatons of carbon per year. Now, it turns out that the ratio at which marine plankton, so primary producers that photosynthesize, they take up carbon and nitrogen, and actually also phosphorus, in an uncannily constant ratio. So on land, some plants will take a little bit more carbon for every nitrogen, some a bit less. But in the ocean, the ratio of carbon uptake to nitrogen uptake seems to be remarkably close to this ratio of 106 to 16, and also to 1. So for every 1 phosphorus, you need 16 nitrogens, and if you have those, then you can uptake 106 carbon dioxides. Nobody really knows why they're at that ratio, but they are. It doesn't really matter for the purposes of this calculation, but we can basically use these numbers to work out for 60 gigatons of carbon, we need about 11 gigatons of nitrogen per year. Okay. Now, the supply is only this 260 teragrams, or 260 gigatons, or 0.26 gigatons. So we don't have enough. Yeah, this number is a lot smaller than this number. Okay, so the nitrogen must come from somewhere. And in the ocean, if we look at the surface of the ocean, most of the surface of the ocean is this blue color, which is basically no nitrate available. Okay, so then life is going on in quite a lot of these regions. So where's it coming from? And it's coming from mostly the deep ocean. Okay? Because life can only go on in the surface ocean. You can only get primary productivity, so only the initial uptake of nutrients, the initial uptake of carbon, can only happen in the surface ocean because that requires light. Okay? And the stuff grows, you have lots of biological activity going on up here. It then dies and then sinks into the deep ocean, either through kind of just cells sinking down or being packaged together in kind of some kind of poo. And that sinks down into the deep ocean where it gets dissolved. Okay? Where it gets broken apart by bacteria respiring the organic matter, and that releases the nutrients back into the water column, causing there to be a higher concentration. And you can see, just like with carbon, okay, the Atlantic Ocean has got a slightly lower concentration than the Pacific and the Indian Oceans because those oceans are further along the conveyor belt, so they've had more chance for organic material containing nitrogen to basically rain down into it and then be added to the deep ocean. So this is this idea here that basically if you start up here, you're basically taking surface water that's got a low concentration of nitrogen, nitrates in fact, because life has used it all up. Okay, that low concentration water sinks to the bottom of the ocean. Okay, and as it flows around the deep ocean, organic material is raining down into it and releasing nutrients into it as it goes. So the nitrogen concentration or the nitrate concentration increases along this flow path. Okay, but when this deep water reaches the surface through upwelling, and that's usually driven by winds, either along or offshore if you're on the equator. So wind blows along the coast here, that actually causes upwelling. Blows along the coast here, that causes upwelling. This brings this nutrient-rich water to the surface. Okay, so in these places, you do tend to get an enormous amount of life happening in these regions of the oceans, where you're bringing this water up from the deep, bringing these nutrients, this nitrogen to the surface. Okay, so you can think of this as a kind of a large-scale internal cycling. Okay, so there's internal cycling between the deep ocean and the surface ocean. I guess you also get some internal cycling just within the surface ocean, where some organisms grow, they die, and they get respired before they release their nutrients back to the ocean before they get a chance to sink. Okay, so you get an internal cycling within the surface layer of the ocean, but you also get an internal cycling within the ocean as a whole, going between the deep and the shallow ocean. Okay, so again, this is really important for determining how much life actually goes on. Yeah, so this is the idea. So the internal cycling on land is kind of the same as the internal cycling on the ocean. You're basically taking nitrogen from the organic phase and then releasing it back into the nitrate or the ammonium phase, and that's being turned back into the nitrate phase through nitrification, depending on how much oxygen is in the water at the time. Okay, so the ocean can have all of these processes that happen on land, and so if we get into a place that has low oxygen, we can start to lose available nitrogen from the system or available nitrate by this process of denitrification. So this is where oxygen is kind of run out. We don't have any oxygen remaining. So bacteria start using nitrate as an oxidizer to oxidize their organic carbon to feed on, because everyone likes feeding. So this is that map of basically these oxygen minimum zones. So again, we're just taking a slice of the ocean, 300 meters depth. Okay, so this is where the organic matter is sinking down to the ocean and it's being respired, okay, by bacteria. That removes the oxygen from the water, and you can see these regions where I showed before, where there was lots of biological activity over here, up in the Arabian Gulf here. There's really low oxygen. That's because nutrients are brought to the surface. Loads of life can happen. That creates lots of organic carbon. It then sinks down into the deep ocean. Okay, and when it gets to about 300 meters, that's basically all being respired away. That's removed oxygen from the water. This happens also in the Pacific. Okay, and this is basically a feature of the ocean circulation around here, and that water at 300 meters in here is basically isolated from the atmosphere because of the buoyant surface layer. Okay, so oxygen can't mix down into it. You also have lots of upwelling in this region along these coasts here that's producing lots and lots of organic matter that's causing the oxygen to be used up. So in these zones where we've got lost lots of oxygen, we can have this process of denitrification. Okay, because bacteria, there's still some organic matter left, there's no oxygen left to respire it, so they're using nitrates to respire it and producing nitrous oxide and nitrogen gas. So these are this little cartoon of this oxygen minimum zone. So lots of life going on up here. Organic matter sinks down. As it sinks down, it uses up the oxygen as it's being oxidized. When it gets down to this level here, all the oxygen is kind of used up. So we can start to have denitrification from these bits of water that ultimately find their way back up to the atmosphere. Or in sediments, okay, so in a sediment, you might start to use up all of the oxygen in the pore water as the organic matter in the sediment is basically respired. When you have lots of organic rich sediments, then you can also have anoxic conditions in the sediment, even if the water column has got lots of oxygen in it. And that can be also a source of this loss of available nitrate, this denitrification, formation of nitrogen gas and nitrogen oxide. So that's this flux out. So we've got kind of this flux in from biological fixation and a little bit of rivers coming in. And it looks like those kind of numbers kind of start to match in the sense of we've got a system that's in kind of steady state. There's a small amount of burial. So anytime we bury organic carbon in the sediment, we'll be burying some organic nitrogen as well. So there's a small out term there. But to conclude the nitrogen cycle in the ocean, again, the microbial kind of processes are really key. Fixation and denitrification are the main fluxes into and out of the ocean, and those are almost entirely microbially dominated. Again, internal cycling, so the reuse of nutrients is really important for determining how much life can happen. And then this process of denitrification, so this output term, is really dependent on how much oxygen we have in the water. Okay? And how much oxygen we have in the water is determined by the carbon cycle. Okay, so how much organic carbon is produced in the surface ocean and then sinks down into the deep ocean, and also by the physical circulation of the ocean. So if the ocean can overturn quickly, you're replacing that oxygen poor water with oxygen-rich water from the surface. So if you can either physically overturn, or if you can mix between the surface layer and the deep ocean, then that can mix oxygen down to depth to slow down this process of denitrification. So one of the things that might be happening towards into the future, as the planet gets warmer, okay, so we're making the surface ocean warmer, so that means that it's more buoyant, so it makes it harder to mix into the deep ocean. Okay, it makes it warmer, that means that biological activity will be more active in the surface ocean. So that means we're getting more stratification, so it's harder to mix oxygen down into this 300 meter deep kind of layer. And it's also, we're adding more carbon into it. So we'll be having more respiration in that zone. So in the future, one of the potential impacts of climate change is that the oxygen minimum zones, okay, will get bigger. And they have been getting bigger over the last kind of 50 years or so. Okay? So if that continues, that means we'll have more denitrification, okay, more production of nitrous oxide, and that might enhance the greenhouse gas effect and add to a positive feedback into climate change, okay, which would be bad. It would also be bad for marine life as well, because with these deep oxygen minimum zones, okay, so when you have strong upwelling events during storms or particularly strong winds blowing along the coast, that can bring that oxygen depleted water up onto the continental shelf, and that kills everything, which is kind of bad. So you get these die-off events, which are bad, particularly if you're a benthic fish that must live on the bottom. Anyway, that's not the nitrogen cycle, that's just bad stuff. Anyway, so looking at how we've altered the nitrogen cycle, so we've basically added this additional flux of production of available nitrogen through the Bosch-Haber process. So I mean, this process of creating available nitrogen out of energy and basically gases from the atmosphere. This process is responsible for sustaining the food that about 50% of the world's population eat. Okay, without that additional flux of nitrogen, we would not be able to support the population. Hi. That's quite scary. So this is a really important process for our civilization to have this fixation of nutrients, because without it we wouldn't be able to do the industrial scale farming which allows us to feed our population, which we like our population because they're us. So this is this graph from time. So since the 1950s we've had this kind of green revolution of the industrialization of agriculture, and that's been made possible by the production of fixed nitrogen. Okay, so the consequences of that is we get lots of biological productivity, which is good, but we also are adding more nutrients to the environment. We're adding them into this soluble form, which can quite easily get washed off the land into rivers, into lakes, and into the coastal places. So this increases this problem of so-called nitrification, which is like abundance of nutrients, which increases denitrification. Okay, so this is this slide will appear in another lecture course many times. So this is a map of ocean colour, showing where the chlorophyll is, where the biological activity is. And this is Chesapeake Bay, which I think the Potomac River comes into, and some others. So this is basically a lot of agricultural land drains into this quite enclosed kind of estuary. Okay, and this basically keeps all of the nutrients in one place, which basically means in this bit of the ocean, we have lots of biological activity going on, but it also means that in this region we also have used up basically all of the oxygen in the water. Okay, so this is quite bad for the biology in that place. So in that we get basically we use up all of the oxygen, so we basically are making more of that estuary. I guess ignore this soil a bit, but we're basically more of it anaerobic. Okay, which means we get more denitrification in the coastal system. Okay, so to conclude, I guess I've already said that those three processes are really important. Okay, they're really important. And the main anthropogenic impacts have basically just been adding available nitrate, but adding it in a form which can be easily washed off the land and into the ocean. So it's impacting our coastal ecosystems quite a lot, and also increasing our greenhouse gas emissions. So yeah, so there we go. So that's the end of today. If you've not signed in, I'd appreciate if you did that. I'll just take another picture because some of you came in late. Oh no, hang on. Here we go.
Everyone smile.
I just go again. Right. Everyone say revise at home. Yeah.
Revise at home.
Oh no, that's so. I do understand how technology works. I promise.
You only have to
Right.
create an ally. Yeah, that was very long. Okay.